My son deleted me from the family chat, as if I were a stranger who sneaked into the conversation. He said it was only for working adults and that I didn't understand anything. A week later, when all 12 of them arrived at my country house with suitcases and coolers, the sign on the gate reminded them that old women always keep a card up their sleeve. Charlie kicked me out of the group on my cell phone. When I asked him why, he looked at me the way you look at an old hunting dog that's no good for the trail anymore, and just dropped it. Mom, it was for working adults. You don't understand anything we talk about. I still have that phrase stuck right here, just under my ribs, like a fishhook that refuses to come out. My name is Martha. I am 76 years old. I was widowed 11 years ago, and I raised 3 kids with these hands you now see covered in age spots. I am no saint, but I am not the fool they think I am either. And what none of them knows yet is that this country house they use so much as a free hotel actually has a real owner. And that owner has been me since long before they even learned how to spell the word inheritance. Everything started on one of those mornings that feel perfectly normal. I was happy, to be honest. I had spent the previous week fixing up the garden on the property. The tomato vines were heavier than ever. The yellow lemons were shining, and I had even managed to get the chickens to lay more eggs than usual. I thought, I am going to make some preserves for them to take back to the city. I pictured my grandkids eating homemade jam from their grandmother, and for a little while, I felt useful. I felt loved. I felt like a part of things. I had even bought meat to grill and saved a few bottles of wine that my late Joseph had left aging in the cellar. I was dreaming of them all coming up for a weekend, filling the house with noise again. I used to sit on the porch with my phone in my hand, reading the family group. They talked about work, investments, trips I knew nothing about. I would just type, "That is great, kids," or send a smiley face. I didn't understand all of it, that is true, but I liked being there, even if I was quiet. It made me feel like I still belonged. That morning, the group was more active than ever. They were talking about a long weekend, about escaping the noise of the city. I was smiling to myself in the kitchen while peeling some potatoes. How nice, I thought. They are finally going to remember the old lady. Then it happened. The phone vibrated in a different way. I opened the group and my name was no longer there. They had removed me. I just stared at the screen as if the glass had shattered. I backed out, went back in. Nothing. My picture was gone. It was as if someone had just wiped a stain off a table. I called my oldest son, Charlie, the one who always played the responsible adult. He took a long time to answer. When he did, his voice sounded rushed, like I was a telemarketing call. "Mom, it was for working adults. You don't understand anything we talk about. It is better this way." He didn't yell. He didn't insult me. He said it with that casual tone that hurts worse than a slap to the face, the tone of someone saying, "Take out the trash." I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, long after he had already hung up. The coffee I had put on the stove boiled over and started to smell burnt. I didn't turn it off. I just stood in front of the burner, watching the black bubbles stick to the bottom of the pot. I forgot I was hungry. I forgot it was noon. I could only think about all the times I had lent them that house for their birthdays, for their work parties, so my daughters-in-law could sunbathe without me getting in the way. Then came the silence, an ugly silence, the kind that burrows deep into your bones. I started to remember how Joseph and I built this house. He drove a freight truck, and I sold clothes at the weekend flea market. Every dollar we had left over went into a glass jar we hid under the bed. It wasn't just any jar, it was one of those thick glass ones that used to hold industrial jam. We saved, so we would never have to ask anyone for a dime. When we scraped together enough, we bought the lot. A piece of bare dirt with 4 skinny trees. Joseph would draw blueprints at night on the kitchen table. I sewed curtains out of cheap but tough fabric. It took us 12 years to get the walls standing. 12 years of working Sundays under the sun, of blisters on our hands, of eating rice and eggs just to save on groceries. That house was our retirement, our pride, the place where we planned to die in peace. And now my kids were using it like a free Airbnb. They brought friends, they brought coolers packed with expensive beer. They blasted music I didn't know, and then they left, leaving everything a mess. I always picked up. I always cleaned. I always kept my mouth shut. The day after they kicked me out of the group, my oldest daughter-in-law sent me a private message, acting like absolutely nothing had happened. Martha, can you leave the keys under the big planter? We are going up for a few days with the kids. No, please. No, thank you. No, how are you doing? Just that. Like I was the maid of the estate. I replied, and said yes, of course, because I still hadn't gathered the strength to say no. But inside, something was slowly tearing apart, like an old piece of fabric giving way at the seam. A week later, I found out through my neighbor's wife that they were organizing a massive trip. 12 people, Charlie, his wife, his 2 grown kids, my daughter Laura with her new husband, and 3 of their friends. The youngest, Danny, with his girlfriend and God knows who else. Coolers, meat, speakers, tents just in case. They were planning to arrive Friday at noon and stay until Sunday. Nobody told me. Nobody asked if I wanted to be there. It was as if the owner of the house had ceased to exist. I headed up to the property early Thursday morning. I wanted to be there when they arrived. I don't exactly know why. Maybe to see their faces. Maybe to remind them that I was still breathing. John, the caretaker, saw me pull up and knew immediately that something was wrong. He is a quiet man, the kind who speaks little but sees everything. He is 61, with big, weathered hands from mending fences and pruning trees. He never calls me Mrs. Martha out of pity. He calls me ma'am, as if I still had authority somewhere in this world. Ma'am, do you want me to make you some herbal tea? He asked when he saw me sitting on the porch staring into space. I told him yes, just so he wouldn't worry. While he was boiling the water, I walked into the living room and saw the notebook. That brown leather notebook Joseph had hand-stitched with shoemaker's thread. That was where we logged every expense, every tree we planted, every upgrade. It was filled with our handwriting. 1987. New well, cost $1,200, but worth every penny. 1994. Kitchen roof, Martha picked the shingles. It was our memory, our will, written without lawyers. Charlie arrived first. He walked in without knocking, like he owned the place. He saw me sitting in my usual chair and scowled. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I explained, keeping my voice as steady as I could, that I had been removed from the group, that nobody had told me they were coming. He sighed, like I was a math problem he couldn't solve. "It was so we wouldn't bother you with adult things, Mom. You have rested enough. Let us enjoy the weekend in peace." Then he did something that I still cannot talk about without my voice shaking. He saw the notebook on the table, that notebook that smelled like Joseph, like hard work, like us. He picked it up, flipped through it without a shred of interest, and tossed it into the trash can next to the fireplace. Just like that, like throwing away yesterday's newspaper. These old things just gather dust. "You should clean up a bit, Mom. Make the house look decent for the guys." I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of him. I just stared at the notebook, lying there among orange peels and dirty napkins. John, who was walking in with the tea, saw the whole thing. He didn't say a word right then. He just set the cup down next to me. He rested his hand on my shoulder for a single second, the kind of touch that says, "I am right here," without needing any words. And then he walked back out to the yard. That tiny gesture hurt me more than my own son's contempt, because John, who barely makes enough to live in a little adobe house out back, treated me with more dignity than my own flesh and blood. I went to the bedroom that belonged to Joseph and me. I sat on the bed, which still has the quilt I knitted back in 1998. I looked out the window and watched my kids and their partners unload coolers, bags, speakers. They were laughing, making plans. Not one of them invited me to sit with them. Laura walked right down the hallway and didn't even turn her head to say hello. It was like I was a piece of old furniture in the way. I stayed in there for a long time. My hands were shaking. I felt a hollow space in my chest that nothing could fill. I remembered when Charlie was a little boy burning up with a fever. I spent whole nights sitting beside him, putting cold rags on his forehead. I remembered when Laura fell off her bike and I had to carry her 2 miles into town because we didn't have a car. I remembered Danny, the youngest, sleeping glued to my side because he was terrified of thunder. And now, not a single one of them could spare 5 minutes for me without looking annoyed. John came back later. He brought a bowl of soup he had made at his place. It wasn't anything fancy, just chicken broth with noodles, but he set it down in front of me like it was a 5-star banquet. "Ma'am, if you want, I can tell them to leave. This is your house." I told him no, not yet, but that night, listening to them laugh and blast their music, something started shifting inside me. It wasn't anger yet. It was more like when a seed finds a crack in solid rock and decides to grow, even if it has to force its way through. I remembered all the documents I kept in a metal lockbox under the hardwood floor in the bedroom. Documents my kids never asked to see. Documents that proved, with clear ink and county seals, that this house was never transferred to them, that I never signed a single thing, that every inch of this place was still mine. I didn't say anything that night. I stayed quiet. But for the first time in a very long time, I slept without shedding a single tear. Because when a mother gets tired of being the one who always understands, the one who always forgives, the one who always cleans up the mess, she starts to remember that she also knows exactly how to lock a door. The next day, the rest of them arrived. 12 in total. The iron gate that Joseph had welded with his own hands was locked tight with a brand new chain. They got out of their cars laughing, hauling red and blue coolers, carrying grocery bags with expensive labels. Charlie was the first to walk up. He saw the sign I had painted myself the night before, in big, clear letters, using the same white paint we used to mark the fruit trees. The sign read, "Private property, entry by owner's invitation only. Those who deleted me from the group already know where the exit is." Nobody moved. Laura was the first to speak, using that high-pitched voice she gets when things don't go her way. "This is ridiculous. It's the family house." I was on the other side of the gate, sitting in my usual chair, with John standing right beside me like a silent guard. I didn't stand up. I didn't yell. I just looked at them, one by one, slowly, the way you look at someone you thought you knew, only to realize you never really did. And for the first time in years, I felt like the one who truly understood everything was me. They had absolutely no idea how much, but they were about to find out. My son stood in front of the gate, with the exact same face he used to make as a kid when someone took away his toy. The others started unloading the coolers and the suitcases, acting like they still believed this was all just a misunderstanding that a quick smile would fix. I watched them from the living room window, half hidden behind the curtain Joseph had hung in '92. I didn't move. I didn't yell. I just watched Laura checking her phone, Danny trying to peek through the iron bars, and somebody's girlfriend already complaining about the dust on her shoes. John stood next to me with his arms crossed. I didn't need to explain a thing to him. He had seen the notebook in the trash the day before, and had fished it out without me even asking. He handed it to me in total silence, like someone handing over a loaded weapon. That brown leather notebook with the crooked stitches Joseph had made with shoemaker's thread still smelled like sawdust and burnt coffee. I opened it on the kitchen table and turned the pages slowly. Every line was a reminder. The dollars counted, the trees planted, the well that took 6 months to finally hit water. My kids had never asked about any of that. To them, this property was just a place you showed up to with coolers and left a total mess. I sat down and started writing on the very last page, using the exact same pen I use for my grocery lists. I wrote down the date, the time, and exactly what had just happened. Friday, 12 people arrived unannounced, gate locked, sign posted. I didn't write down any emotions, just the facts, exactly the way Joseph taught me when we first broke ground on this place. While I wrote, I could hear their voices outside. Charlie was already raising his tone, saying this was ridiculous, that I was overreacting because of a WhatsApp group. Laura was answering back, saying it was probably senile dementia, that old women get weird at this age. They were talking loud, like I couldn't hear them, like the walls didn't have ears. I didn't feel anger yet. I felt something colder, something calculated, like when you know a massive storm is coming, but you've already patched every single leak in the roof. That house was not theirs. It never had been. Joseph and I never signed a single paper putting it in their names. Everything was still strictly under my name at the county clerk's office, down to the last inch of dirt. I had the paperwork hidden under the floorboards in the master bedroom, locked inside a metal box we bought at a flea market for $12 back in '86. Nobody knew about that box. Not my kids, not the daughters-in-law, not even John. It was my ace in the hole, the card I kept hidden just in case one day they treated me exactly the way they were treating me right now. I decided it was time to pull it out. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to explain myself. I was going to handle this the same way I handled the market when someone tried to hustle me on a price. Quiet, precise, and leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. While they kept arguing outside about who was going to climb over the gate, I stood up and walked into the bedroom. I locked the door behind me. The sun was streaming through the window, warming the quilt I knitted when Laura turned 15. I got down on my knees next to the bed and lifted the loose floorboard that always used to creak when Joseph got up in the middle of the night. There was the box. The metal was cold to the touch, a little rusted around the corners. I pulled it out with both hands, the way you lift a newborn. That was my ritual. That simple act of kneeling down and lifting the wood was the closest I had come to telling the past that it no longer pulled the strings. I opened the box on the bed. The papers were yellowed, but perfect. The original deed to the land, the one we signed with a notary who has been dead for years. The receipt for every single upgrade, paid for with our own sweat. The folder where I kept the letters Joseph mailed me when he was out on the road driving his route. Everything was right there, untouched. I ran my fingers over every page like I was touching my husband's face. Then I did what I had to do to break free from who I used to be. I gathered up all the spare keys I had handed out to them over the years, 12 complete sets, one for every surprise visit. I dropped them all into a cloth bag. I was going to lock them up. There would be no more unannounced arrivals. There would be no more leaving the keys under the planter. That was the exact moment I stopped being the mother who fixed everything. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and put the box back in its place. But this time, I didn't push the floorboard all the way down. I wanted it to be easy to grab. I wanted it ready. When I walked out of the bedroom, John was waiting for me in the kitchen with a glass of cold water. He didn't ask what I had been doing. He just said, "Ma'am, the youngest is trying to pick the padlock with a piece of wire." The rest of them just set up a folding table outside like this is some kind of picnic. I smiled for the first time in days. A dry smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes. I told him not to open that gate under any circumstances. I told him that if they asked, to tell them the owner was busy. John nodded and walked out. I watched him talk to them through the iron bars. Charlie's face turned bright red. Laura started crying, using those fake tears she pulls out when she wants to manipulate a situation. Danny just stared at his phone, probably trying to figure out how to call a locksmith. I stayed inside, walking slowly through the house. I looked at every corner as if I were seeing it for the very first time. The fridge stuffed with the expensive beer they had left behind last month. The extra towels I always washed specifically for their visits. The good sheets I kept in the closet just in case the kids came up. I started gathering it all. It wasn't out of rage. It was about creating order. I stuffed the towels into a massive trash bag. The sheets too. I hauled them out to the little shed in the back where John kept his tools. When I walked past the window, I saw Charlie trying to call my phone. I let it ring. 5 times, 10 times. Then I flipped my phone to silent and set it on the kitchen table, right next to the notebook. I did a lot of thinking that afternoon. I thought about how, for 11 years of widowhood, I had stayed exactly the same. The one who lent out the house, the one who kept quiet. The one who cooked for 12 mouths without a single complaint. I thought about all the times I canceled my own doctor's appointments just to pay for the kids' car repairs. About how I sold my jewelry to bail Laura out when she divorced her first husband. All of that had built this house too. Every sacrifice was written between the lines of that notebook, and they had thrown it into the garbage like it was an old grocery receipt. John came back inside. His face was serious, but his eyes were completely calm. He told me they had decided to give the old lady some time to cool off. They pitched their tents outside the gate and were grilling meat like nothing was wrong. I could hear the laughter. The smell of the barbecue drifted all the way into the kitchen. It reminded me of every single time I had fired up that exact grill for them. This time, the smell just made me sick to my stomach. I asked John to shut every window facing the front. I told him to turn on the fan in the back, and that we were going to stay in the rear of the house where they couldn't see us. He did it without asking a single question. While he was closing the windows, I pulled out the notebook again and wrote, "We do not open. We do not answer. We begin." I took my first real step just as the sun was starting to set. I picked up the landline, the one that still worked, because Joseph had insisted we keep it, and dialed a number I knew by heart. It was Mr. Ramirez, the notary who had handled all of our paperwork from the very beginning. I didn't tell him the whole story. I just told him I needed to confirm the legal status of the property and asked him to prepare a certified copy of the deed. I asked him to be discreet about it. Mr. Ramirez, who is pushing 80 just like me, simply said, "Understood, Martha. I will have it ready first thing in the morning. Do you want me to bring it to you myself?" I told him yes, and to take the back dirt road, the one John uses when he brings in the chicken feed. I hung up the phone and felt something settle deep in my chest. It wasn't victory yet. It was the click of a key finally turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Outside, they were still at it. They had turned on the music. Someone was laughing loudly. It was probably Danny, telling some story where I was the punchline, the crazy old grandmother who gets mad over nothing. I heard Charlie say, "Just leave her alone. She'll wake up in a better mood tomorrow and open the gate. She always does." Laura answered that she hoped so, because she had already paid for Saturday's catering, and she wasn't about to lose the deposit. They were talking about me like I was a dog that barks but never bites, like the house belonged to them, and I was just an annoying tenant. I sat on the back porch, where the late afternoon sun hits the garden. John brought me a bowl of soup he had made at his place, the exact same chicken noodle soup from the day before, but this time, he put a much bigger piece of chicken in it. He sat down about 6 feet away from me on a wooden stool. He didn't say much, but his presence felt like a brick wall. While I ate, I thought about how this man, who barely makes enough money to survive in his little adobe house, had treated me with more respect in 48 hours than my 3 kids had in a decade. He asked me if I wanted him to sleep close to the house that night, just in case. I told him yes. I told him to bring his cot and set it up on the back patio. Not because I was scared, it was strategy. I wanted them to see that I was not alone. When night fell, the lights from their tents looked like fireflies on the other side of the gate. I had turned off almost every light in the house. Only one lamp was on in the kitchen, shining down on the notebook. I opened it again. I started writing down exactly what I was going to do. It wasn't a revenge plan, it was an audit. First, the formal eviction notice, then a full accounting of the last 3 years. Exactly how much they had supposedly spent on maintenance that never actually happened. Exactly how much they had taken without asking. And finally, the decision that absolutely nobody saw coming. Because this house wasn't just mine. It was mine, and it held a value they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But they didn't know that part yet. I wrote until my hand cramped. John was snoring softly out on the patio. Outside, someone had finally turned down the music. They were probably tired of waiting for the old lady to come out and apologize. I closed the notebook. I ran my hand over the brown leather like you'd pet an old, loyal horse, and I left it on the table. Tomorrow, Mr. Ramirez would come up the back road. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. They thought this was just a tantrum from an old woman who got kicked out of a group chat. They had no idea that the only group that actually mattered was the one I had been building all by myself for decades. In total silence, with county records, notary seals, and the patience of a saint. I lay down in the big bed. The quilt still smelled like the lavender detergent from the last time I washed it for them. I folded it up carefully and put it in the closet. I pulled out the old rough blanket, the one Joseph and I used to sleep under when we didn't have company. It was scratchy. It had patches sewn into it, but it was ours. I pulled it over myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel cold. Outside, an owl was hooting. Inside, the notebook waited on the kitchen table like a guard dog. And I, Martha, 76 years old, widow, mother of 3 ungrateful children, was finally starting to remember exactly who had built all of this with her own 2 hands. They slept in tents that night. I slept in my own bed, and when the sun came up, the gate was still locked. The sign was still there. And I was no longer the woman who got deleted from a group chat. I was the owner of the estate, and I was ready for them to know it, but not quite yet. First, I had to make a few more phone calls. First, I had to finish writing down every single thing they had forgotten in that notebook. Because old women always keep a card up their sleeve, and mine still had plenty of pages left. My son woke up in a cheap tent that barely kept out the morning dew. I was up before the rooster crowed, just like always. The brown leather notebook was sitting on the kitchen table, open to the last page. I picked up my pen and kept writing, slowly, with firm handwriting, even though my joints ached a bit from the damp air. Saturday. Dawn broke with 12 people outside. We did not open. Mr. Ramirez is coming up the back road. I closed the notebook and ran my hand over it. It was the only thing left that still smelled like Joseph. Like sawdust, black coffee, and late nights balancing the checkbook by candlelight. I brewed coffee in the usual pot. Black, no sugar, strong. John was already awake on the patio. I watched him fold up his cot carefully, without making a sound, like he didn't want to wake the people sleeping on the other side of the gate. He looked at me and gave a single nod. That was all it took. This 61-year-old man, with hands covered in calluses from fixing everything my kids broke, was more family to me than the 3 children I gave birth to. He brought me a glass of cold well water and stood in the doorway, waiting for instructions. "Ma'am," the youngest got up early. "He is checking the padlock again," he said in a low voice. I told him not to worry about it. I told him we weren't opening the gate today, but we weren't going to hide either. I asked him to keep an eye on the back dirt road, the one that runs past the lemon trees. Mr. Ramirez was due any minute, and I didn't want my kids spotting him. John tipped his worn-out hat and walked out without another word. I sat in my chair on the back porch, where the morning sun hits perfectly, and you can hear the wind moving through the tomato vines. They couldn't see me from there. They were still out front, forcing fake laughs, smelling like the cheap instant coffee they brought in their expensive thermoses. I heard Laura complaining about how freezing the tent was, and Charlie telling her, "The old lady is going to cave. She always caves." Mr. Ramirez arrived right on time, just like he has for 30 years. He drove his beat-up truck up the dirt road with the headlights off so he wouldn't draw attention. John brought him in through the kitchen door. The notary was holding a thick manila envelope, sealed and signed across the flap in blue ink. He sat down across from me at the pine table Joseph had built back in '89. He didn't ask how I was doing. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses and got straight to the point. "Martha, here are the certified copies. The original deed has been in your name since 1978. Nothing was ever transferred, not to the kids, not to a trust, not to anyone. Every single thing is yours, right down to the last chicken in the coop." I listened to him in silence. I poured him coffee in the chipped mug he always used when he came to visit Joseph and me. I told him the whole story, the group chat, the notebook thrown in the trash, the sign on the gate. I didn't exaggerate a single detail, just the facts, exactly the way we logged them in the notebook. Mr. Ramirez shook his head slowly, like a man who has seen it all in the county records office. "Here is exactly what we are going to do," he said, lowering his voice. "First, I am giving you this formal notice. It is an eviction letter stating they are occupying private property without the express authorization of the owner. They have 24 hours to vacate, or it becomes criminal trespassing. Second, I drew up a calculation based on the expenses you logged in that notebook of yours. The maintenance they never paid for, the electricity, the water, the groceries they left rotting in the fridge. These are hard numbers, Martha. It's not anger, it's accounting." I took the letter from him. The paper was heavy, smelling like fresh printer ink. I read it twice. Everything was there. The date we bought the lot. The 12 years of back-breaking labor. The receipts for every single upgrade. and at the bottom, a number that wasn't exaggerated, but it stung. It was the exact equivalent of what they had blown on craft beer and barbecues over the last 3 years, without contributing a single dime to the property. Mr. Ramirez looked me dead in the eye. Now comes the part they are not expecting. I have a recent medical certificate for you. Dr. Morales, the same physician who saw you last month, signed a full declaration of mental competency. I requested it 2 weeks ago, when you called me worried about how they were treating you. It is dated before they kicked you out of the group. Nobody can walk into a courtroom and claim you are senile, or that you don't know what you are doing. This is your armor, Martha. I have it right here. Stamped copies for every single one of them. I put the medical certificate back into the envelope along with the eviction notice. I felt the weight of the paper in my hands, and something clicked into place in my chest. It wasn't joy, it was order. The exact same order Joseph and I used to build this house, stone by stone, without rushing but never stopping. John stood in the doorway, listening to the whole exchange without interrupting. When Mr. Ramirez stood up to leave, I asked him to drive out the same back way he came in. I stayed alone in the kitchen for a moment. I opened the notebook again and wrote down the exact time Mr. Ramirez left. 10:47 a.m. Documents ready, bulletproof. Charlie walked up to the gate and started banging his palm against the iron chain. "Mom, this is insane. Open the gate right now." I didn't answer. I stood in the living room with the curtains barely cracked, watching them. Danny was trying to plug his phone into a portable battery that was already flashing dead. Somebody's girlfriend was whining about the heat and the smell of dirt. They had planned a luxury weekend getaway using my country house as a free hotel. Now they had camping tents, dust, and a padlock. John brought me a plate of rice and eggs he had cooked on his own stove. We ate in silence at the kitchen table. He didn't talk much, but every time he poured me water or adjusted my chair so I'd be more comfortable, he reminded me that respect has absolutely nothing to do with blood. In the afternoon, I turned up the heat. I told John to nail a second sign right next to the first one. Smaller, but impossible to miss. It read, "Private property. Unauthorized occupation will result in charges for improper use. See attached notice." We nailed it to the wooden post Joseph had put in the ground 30 years ago. Then, I called the town cop, Officer Davis, Mrs. Higgins' boy. He has known me since he was a kid. I didn't ask him to come out with his sirens blazing. I just explained the situation and texted him a photo of the legal notice. He told me that whenever I gave the word, he would come out and file the trespassing report. I saved that text message. Everything was going on the record. Around 3 in the afternoon, when the sun was brutal and the inside of those tents felt like an oven, I decided it was time. I told John to put on a clean shirt. Mr. Ramirez had already driven back up the dirt road with 2 more copies of the paperwork. The 3 of us walked to the gate together. I walked slowly, the manila envelope in my hand, the notebook tucked under my arm. My hands weren't shaking. All 12 of them were gathered on the other side, sweating, looking miserable and hungry. They had tried to grill meat using some old charcoal they dug out of the shed, but the smoke was just choking them. When they saw me walking up, they went dead silent. Charlie was the first to speak, using his, "I'm the oldest, so I'm in charge" voice. "Mom, enough with the theater. Open the gate and let's talk like a family." I didn't unlock it. I just slid the chain enough to pass the envelope through the gap. Mr. Ramirez was standing on my right, wearing his deadpan notary face. John was on my left, quiet as a stone. They crowded around. Laura grabbed the envelope like it was on fire. She ripped it open and started reading out loud. Her voice was strong at first, but it completely faded out when she hit the section with the numbers. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her hands were shaking. Then came the moment I can still see perfectly whenever I close my eyes. Charlie reached through the bars and tried to yank the chain off the gate. At that exact second, Officer Davis pulled up the main road on his police motorcycle. I hadn't called him yet. Mr. Ramirez had. Discreetly, while we were walking down to the gate, the officer kicked his kickstand down, tipped his hat to me, and stood right by my side. All 12 of them stared at the badge. Charlie dropped the chain like it was electrified. Laura went ghostly pale. Danny literally dropped his phone in the dirt. I spoke up for the first time. Loud, clear, but without screaming. I read whole paragraphs of the eviction notice right to their faces. I reminded them that the house was never theirs. That every single dollar they blew on beer and Bluetooth speakers over my 11 years of widowhood was logged in my notebook. That the well, the roof, the walls, Joseph and I paid for every nail by driving trucks and selling clothes at the flea market. And that from this second forward, if they wanted to step foot on this dirt, they needed a written invitation signed by me. Officer Davis took notes on his pad. John kept his hand on the gate so it wouldn't swing open an inch more than necessary. The sun was glaring off the white sign I had painted. The smell of their burnt barbecue mixed with their nervous sweat. When I finished reading, Mr. Ramirez added in his calm, legal voice that everything was fully enforceable. Charlie opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Laura had real tears running down her face this time. Not the fake ones she used to get her way. Danny just stared at his boots. The friends and the girlfriends they had dragged along started backing away slowly, like they didn't want to get caught in the blast radius. Let me know in the comments, would you have done the same thing I did, or would you have played it differently? Because I was standing there, 76 years old, looking at the children I raised with my own worn-out hands. And for the very first time, I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. I felt like the notebook was finally speaking. Like Joseph was speaking. Like the woman who hoarded pennies in jam jars for 12 straight years was finally speaking. They launched their counterattack immediately. Charlie's face turned crimson, and he started shouting. He said this was elder abuse, that I was being brainwashed by John and the notary, that he was calling a city lawyer right now to have me declared legally incompetent. You are not well, Mom. This is dementia. I am bringing a judge out here tomorrow. Laura jumped in, sobbing harder, claiming I had always been easily manipulated, that ever since Dad died I had gone crazy. Danny, the youngest, stayed totally quiet, but his thumbs were flying across his phone screen, probably texting another relative to bail them out. I just stood there and let them talk. Mr. Ramirez pulled the medical certificate out of the envelope and slid it under the gate. Officer Davis looked at it and wrote down the date. It was stamped exactly 2 weeks before they kicked me out of the group chat. There was absolutely no way to claim it was forged or done after the fact. Charlie read the paper, and the color completely drained from his face. He tried one last desperate angle. This isn't over. We are your family. You can't treat us like criminals. I answered him calmly. The exact same voice I used when they were little kids, and I had to explain why there was no money for new toys. Family is what you build every single day, Charlie. Not something you use when you need a free place to throw a barbecue. You have until noon tomorrow. After that, I am having you trespassed. John pulled the chain tight and locked the padlock. Mr. Ramirez shook my hand firmly and walked back to his truck. Officer Davis tipped his hat again. Mrs. Martha, you call me if you need anything at all, he said, and fired up his motorcycle. I stayed at the gate for a few more minutes, watching them pack up their garbage, shoving tents into bags furiously, hauling coolers that didn't even have ice in them anymore. The stench of burnt meat just hung in the air like a warning label. I walked back to the house with John. He opened the kitchen door for me and poured me a tall glass of lemonade made from the lemons in my garden. He didn't say good job or anything like that. He just sat across from me and asked if I wanted him to heat up the soup for dinner. That tiny, simple gesture hurt me and healed me at the exact same time. Because while my own kids were plotting how to throw me in a psych ward, John, who owes me absolutely nothing, treated me like the woman who runs her own house. I opened the notebook one last time that evening. I wrote down everything that had happened, hour by hour. The names, the looks on their faces when they read the paperwork. The ink flowed smoothly. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. Outside, I could hear their car engines starting up. They were leaving, but I knew it wasn't over. I knew they would come back with lawyers, with threats, with more crying. But I had already locked the first door, and my notebook still had plenty of blank pages left. I sat in my chair on the back porch as the sun went down. The garden was perfectly still. John was sweeping the patio, taking his time. And I, Martha, 76 years old, with age spots all over my hands, felt for the first time in years that the one who truly understood how the world worked wasn't them, it was me. And the card I had up my sleeve wasn't just the deed to the property, it was everything I had built when nobody was looking. They drove away thinking this ended with a piece of paper. They had no idea it was just getting started. Tomorrow they would come back swinging, and I would be waiting. With my notebook, with my notary seals, and with the terrifying patience of a woman who waited 11 years to be told she didn't understand anything. My son came back the very next day. His face was swollen from sleeping in a cheap bed, and he had a lawyer standing next to him who looked more lost than a dog at Sunday Mass. The sun was beating down hard on the gate, the same gate Joseph welded 30 years ago, and my white sign was still hanging there, without an ounce of pity. Charlie's suit was wrinkled. Laura was walking like every step physically hurt her. Danny was trailing behind them, staring at his phone, trying to get a signal that didn't exist out here. I found out later they had spent the night at a rundown motel out on the highway, the kind that triples the rate when they see city plates. Their friends had bailed on them, furious. The meat in the coolers went bad in the trunks of their cars. The luxury weekend getaway had turned into a screaming match over a motel bill nobody wanted to split. The expensive catering Laura booked was completely non-refundable. The grandkids were complaining about the dirt, and Danny's girlfriend had threatened to dump him if this was what being part of his family looked like. All of that, just because an old woman who didn't understand anything finally locked her own front gate. I watched them from the kitchen window. The brown leather notebook was open on the table. John was standing next to me, quiet as always, but he was gripping a push broom like it was a shotgun. I had brewed coffee for 2, not 12. The smell filled the house, mixing with the scent of the tomato vines growing outside, completely indifferent to the family drama. Mr. Ramirez had texted me at dawn. Everything is filed. It's bulletproof. The medical certificate was backed up in 3 different county offices. They could scream about dementia all they wanted. The paper had an ironclad date, a real doctor's signature, and a state seal that doesn't wash away with tears. Charlie spoke first when I walked up to the gate. I didn't undo the chain. I didn't open it an inch. The lawyer, a skinny guy in glasses sweating through his collar, cleared his throat and pulled out a stack of papers. Mrs. Martha, this is a family misunderstanding. My clients just want to open a dialogue. Yesterday's eviction notice was an extreme overreaction. I just stared at him. He had the exact same look as the hustlers at the flea market trying to sell me defective fabric. John took one step back and crossed his arms. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't standing alone, even though my own blood was on the wrong side of the fence. I slid 2 plastic cups of water through the iron bars. Not out of kindness. Strategy. I wanted them to know I was still the one deciding what came in and what went out of my territory. Laura took the cup, but she didn't drink. She launched right into the crying routine I knew by heart. The exact same tears she used in grade school when she wanted her sister's doll. Mom, please, we are your kids. You sacrificed everything for us. Dad would hate seeing this. You are treating us like felons over a stupid group chat. I just wanted you to relax. I didn't want to bore you with our adult problems. Charlie nodded like he was the backup singer in a terrible band. Exactly. You are being manipulated, Mom. That guy John and the notary are filling your head with garbage. We can bring a real doctor out here. A specialist who understands what happens to people your age. We aren't trying to take anything from you. We just want to protect you. Danny didn't say a word. He just kept his eyes glued to the notebook tucked under my arm. I smiled. One of those dry smiles Joseph used to say I got right before I tore a scammer apart at the market. I answered them without raising my voice, like I was explaining why the rice burned. Manipulated by who, Charlie? By the notebook you threw in the garbage like a dirty rag? By the deeds Joseph and I signed when you were still wearing diapers? That is your whole problem. You thought I was just a decoration, the one who cooks, the one who cleans, the one who shuts up. And now that the decoration locked the gate, suddenly I'm crazy. The lawyer tried to jump in. He started throwing around words like sudden incapacitation, and legal conservatorship. He said he could file an emergency motion that very afternoon, that a judge would clearly see a 76-year-old woman couldn't manage a massive estate all by herself. That was when I pulled out the envelope Mr. Ramirez had left me. I opened it slowly, like someone unwrapping a gift they already know they are going to love. I slid the copy of the medical certificate through the bars. The lawyer read it, and the blood literally drained from his face. Dated 15 days before they kicked me out of the chat. Signed by my primary care physician of 20 years. Full mental capacity. Full capacity to manage financial assets. Full capacity to decide who steps foot on my land. Charlie read over the lawyer's shoulder and let out a curse under his breath. Laura stopped crying instantly. That was the exact moment they realized the battlefield had completely changed. They really thought a cheap lawyer and some emotional blackmail would fix it. It didn't. Charlie shifted gears. He offered to pay fair market rent for using the property. Laura said they could put the deed in all 3 of their names so I wouldn't have to stress about it anymore. Danny stayed quiet, but I could see his hands shaking. I listened to them, logging every single word in my head, the same way I logged numbers in the notebook since '87. When they finally ran out of breath, I opened the notebook to the page I had prepped the night before. My handwriting, clean, clear, the numbers lined up straight, just like Joseph taught me. First, we are going to talk about your debt, I told them. This isn't a favor, it is accounting. 11 years since Joseph died. 137 weekends you used this house without paying a single electric bill, a water bill, or fixing the roof tiles you cracked with your speakers. Add in the beer, the meat, the propane, the ruined mattresses, and the well pump that burns out faster because 12 people take showers like water falls from the sky for free. According to the numbers Joseph and I always kept, you owe me $24,000. It is not revenge. It is exactly what you spent. What you never pitched in for, what you threw away because you thought the old lady was footing the bill. They went dead silent. Laura opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Charlie looked at his lawyer, begging him to say this wasn't legally binding. The lawyer mumbled something about exaggerated figures, but he didn't sound convinced. They thought that was it. They thought if they just paid the money, or negotiated it down, they'd get the keys back. That was when I snapped the notebook shut. I ran my fingers over the rough leather one last time, and I dropped the second bomb. The one that was going to snap them in half. But what I am about to tell you is bigger, much bigger. You thought this property was just the little cabin we built. Point A, like you guys call it in your little chats for working adults. Well, it's point A plus point B, and it's 10 times bigger than you think. 8 years ago, when I started noticing how you were slowly erasing me from your lives, I went to Mr. Ramirez. I set up an LLC, everything under my name. This cabin, the 2 back acres you thought were dead dirt, all the way to the well and the tomato vines. That LLC holds exclusive contracts with 2 corporate firms out of the city. They bring corporate groups up here every single month. Executive retreats, team building seminars, the kind of stuff you guys talk about in your chat that I supposedly don't understand. They pay $800 a day, kids. Every single time you weren't here, this property was clocking in. That money never went into your inheritance. It goes into a trust that I manage. And according to the ironclad paperwork I signed 6 years ago, every dime goes to a foundation for widows just like me. This notebook isn't just a diary. It is a notarized financial ledger. Everything Joseph and I wrote down is admissible in court. And a judge already has a copy. The silence was so heavy you could feel it. Even the chickens stopped making noise. Charlie turned the color of ash. Laura grabbed the iron gate like her legs were going to give out. The lawyer started ripping through his briefcase like a maniac, looking for a loophole that didn't exist. Danny was the only one who spoke. His voice was low, almost broken. Mom, you built all of this by yourself? I looked him dead in the eyes. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel an ounce of motherly guilt. I felt the weight of every penny shoved into a jam jar. Every night I spent sewing cheap curtains. Every time I said sure when I wanted to scream enough. Not by myself, Danny. With Joseph. with the notebook, and with the exact same brain you all said didn't understand how investments work. Turns out I understood a hell of a lot more than you thought, and right now, the only people who don't understand anything are you. Charlie tried one last Hail Mary. He turned bright red and started screaming, just like when he was a teenager and I wouldn't give him the keys to the truck. He said he was going to sue the LLC, that he was hiring forensic accountants, that he was going to prove I was coerced, that John was extorting me, and Mr. Ramirez was a senile old fool. He threatened to call the district attorney. He threatened to go to the local news. Every desperate threat a panicked man could throw at the wall. Laura backed him up, sobbing for real this time, screaming that I was destroying the family, that Dad would be disgusted with me. The lawyer just kept sweating, because he had seen the paperwork, and he knew this was going to be a long, brutally expensive bloodbath he couldn't win. I didn't flinch, but John did. He took one heavy step forward and slapped his massive hand against the iron gate, not to open it, just to remind Charlie that this land had an owner, and the owner had a guard dog. I gave them my final offer when they finally shut up out of pure exhaustion. It wasn't an apology. It was a verbal contract, with witnesses, and I logged it in the notebook 5 minutes later. Listen to me very closely, because I am only saying this once. If you ever want to step foot on this dirt again, you are going to sign a legally binding agreement that Mr. Ramirez is drafting this week. First, you pay the $24,000 in 6 installments. No negotiating. Second, you request permission in writing 30 days in advance. Maximum 6 people, maximum 2 weekends a year. Third, you pay $200 a month for maintenance, the well pump, the electricity, the repairs. Fourth, you never, ever delete me from a group chat, a conversation, or a family decision again. And fifth, and this is the one that's going to choke you the most, John gets a fixed salary as the property manager, paid out by the LLC, because he has shown me more respect in 3 days than you have in 11 years. Danny was the first to drop his head. I saw something absolutely shatter inside him. It wasn't manipulation. It was pure, unfiltered shame. Charlie muttered that my terms were extortion, and he was going to fight me in court. Laura just stood there crying, but I had already closed the notebook. The sun was dipping low, and the smell of wet earth was rising from the garden because John had watered it early. I told them they had exactly 1 week to decide, that the gate was staying locked until they signed, that this property was nobody's free hotel anymore. When they drove away, their shoulders slumped, the lawyer shoving his useless papers back into his briefcase. I sat on the back porch with John. He brought me a bowl of chicken noodle soup, the exact same soup as always. But this time, he put extra chicken in it. He said, "You earned it today, ma'am." We ate in silence. The notebook sat between us like an old friend who had finally taken the stand and testified. I ran my hand over the brown leather one more time, feeling the crooked stitches Joseph had made with his shoemaker's thread. I thought about all the times they made me feel invisible. All the times I scrubbed their messes without a single thank you. And how a sentence as simple as, "You don't understand anything," was the exact spark I needed to remember that I had understood the game from the very beginning. They drove away, thinking they could still win on a technicality. I sat there knowing the game was completely over. I didn't feel hatred. I felt order. The rules were set. I knew with absolute certainty that the old lady they deleted from their phones was the exact same woman who now dictated who got to walk through the front door and who stayed locked out in the dirt forever. And the notebook. That notebook they threw into the garbage. Its final pages were now written in the most expensive ink in the world. The ink of someone who no longer has to ask for permission to exist inside her own house. Tomorrow, Mr. Ramirez would come back. Tomorrow, the new contracts would be drafted. And I, Martha, would keep logging the numbers. Because old women don't just keep a card up their sleeve. Sometimes, the entire sleeve is a custom-tailored suit. And my kids had just figured out that the suit never actually belonged to them. 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days have passed since that afternoon. Since I watched their hunched backs disappear down the dirt road, the cheap lawyer sweating through his suit, the iron gate locked behind them like a judge's gavel coming down. The brown leather notebook now has 37 brand new pages filled with my handwriting, dates, deposits, signatures, everything logged with the exact same ruthless precision Joseph taught me back when we thought getting old meant getting peace. Mr. Ramirez drove up the back road the very next morning, exactly like he promised. Together, we hammered out the ironclad agreement. 6 installments of $4,000 each. Written permission required. 6 people maximum. $200 a month for upkeep. And John's salary, which hits his account on the first of the month, directly from the LLC. Everything stamped. Everything filed. Everything irreversible. The property doesn't smell like hungover kids hauling coolers and leaving empty beer bottles in the grass anymore. Now, it smells like wet earth after a thunderstorm. Like ripe lemons. Like the black coffee John brews every morning in the same dented pot. The corporate contracts with the city firms are locked in. Last month, they bust in 30 executives from a private bank. They paid $900 a day for 4 straight days. I watched them roll their expensive suitcases up the driveway in their perfectly pressed shirts. And for the very first time, I didn't feel like I was lending out my house. I felt like I was cashing the check for what Joseph and I built with our own bare hands. John met them at the gate in a crisp shirt and that beat-up hat that's practically glued to his head. He laid down the ground rules without raising his voice once. I stayed on the back porch, sitting in my usual chair, watching the tomato vines keep producing fruit like absolutely nothing had changed. But there is one specific morning I remember sharper than the rest. The sun was warming the kitchen tiles. John had just cooked breakfast for 8 corporate guys here for a leadership retreat. Scrambled eggs with herbs straight from the garden, fresh baked bread, black coffee. I was balancing the ledger in the notebook when I heard a familiar engine shut off on the back dirt road. The road we use when we don't want anyone to see us coming. It wasn't Charlie, it wasn't Laura, it was Danny. He walked up alone. He was holding a brown paper bag, and his head was hanging low. He looked like a man carrying a weight he couldn't hide anymore. 4 months without a word. No calls, no texts. And now he was standing at my back screen door, waiting for me to tell him if he was allowed to step inside. "Hey, Mom," he said. His voice didn't have that arrogant bounce anymore. He sounded older, exhausted. I didn't stand up. John stayed by the sink, drying coffee mugs like he wasn't paying attention, but I knew his hand was hovering near the door. Danny was always the quietest of the 3. The one who just stared at his boots at the front gate while Charlie screamed and Laura threw a tantrum. Maybe that's why he was the only one who broke rank and came back before the deadline. He wired his chunk of the first installment last month without a single argument. Mr. Ramirez verified the transfer, but paying the fine wasn't enough. I needed to see the completely broken ego. "Sit down," I told him, pointing to the chair across from me. I didn't offer him coffee yet. He had to earn the coffee. He sat down slowly, like he was afraid the chair would snap. He put the paper bag on the pine table. Inside was a glass jar of tomato jam, the exact kind I used to make from scratch, the kind he used to beg for when he was a little boy. It wasn't an expensive apology gift. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to remind me that we actually used to be a family. He told me everything, his voice cracking on the syllables. Charlie refused to pay a dime. He was blindingly furious. He hired a shark lawyer in the city and swore he was going to drag this out until the LLC bled dry. Laura completely vanished. She moved 2 states away with her new husband. She only sends one-line text messages saying she doesn't have the mental bandwidth to deal with a mother who hates them. Danny stayed behind. He lost a massive contract at his firm because his clients heard about the family meltdown and didn't want the liability. He is working for himself now. Smaller accounts, humbling work. "I understand that the rules changed, Mom," he said, staring directly at the leather notebook instead of my face. "I didn't know how to stop Charlie that day. I just let it happen. But after sleeping 3 nights in that trashy motel, after thinking about how we drove away with soaking wet tents and our pride completely shattered, I realized that the only person who didn't understand anything was me, not you." I didn't answer him right away. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. Outside, you could hear the bank executives walking toward the garden. John was giving them a tour, explaining how Joseph dug the 80-foot well by hand. The contrast was almost funny. My youngest son, who used to kick the door open holding a cooler full of IPA beers, was now begging for permission to sit at my kitchen table. Meanwhile, the LLC was humming, generating enough to pay John's salary. Enough to send a massive monthly check to the Widows Foundation Mr. Ramirez is setting up in the next county over. Enough so that I could finally go to the doctor without canceling my appointment to bail my kids out of a mechanic's bill. I poured him a cup of coffee, not because I had magically forgiven him, but because I looked in his eyes and saw the one thing Charlie and Laura lacked: genuine, burning shame. I laid out the terms for him again, slowly, so there was zero misinterpretation. You can come up here once every 3 months, alone or with your girlfriend. But you request it in writing. You help with the maintenance. You weed the back acreage. You check the perimeter fence. You do whatever John tells you to do. And under absolutely no circumstances do you ever look at me like I am a burden who has outlived her usefulness. Danny nodded. He stayed until the sun went down. He chopped dead wood out back with John. He didn't complain about the heat once. When he finally left, he left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. Thank you for not locking the deadbolt forever. I am going to prove I deserve a key. That was the partial redemption. Just him. Charlie is still bleeding cash on lawyers who keep telling him his case is garbage. Laura posts beach vacation photos on social media, pretending her life is perfect. But the neighbor's wife told me her marriage is hanging by a thread, and she definitely doesn't brag about the family's country estate anymore. They picked their poison. Danny is picking the cure. It's slower and it hurts more, and I don't feel a drop of pity for any of them. I feel like the ledger is finally balanced. But the wildest part of this whole thing is what happened outside the family. 2 weeks after Danny showed up, Mrs. Higgins, Officer Davis's mother, came up the dirt road. She brought 3 other women from the weekend flea market. Women exactly my age, widows exactly like me. They had heard the whispers about the painted sign on the gate, about how an old lady completely neutralized 3 greedy kids. They sat on my back porch, in the late afternoon sun, and asked me to tell them the whole story. It wasn't town gossip. It was pure survival. One of them, Mrs. Miller, who used to sell fabric right next to my stall, grabbed my hand. Her eyes were glassy. "Martha, you spoke for every single one of us," she said. "I let my daughter-in-law live in my house for 7 years, and now she doesn't even look me in the eye. I thought mothers just had to swallow the poison. You proved we don't. Now, we meet on the first Tuesday of every month. I call them the Notebook Women. They bring their own horror stories, their own secret jam jars stuffed with cash hidden under their mattresses. And I open my brown leather notebook and show them exactly how Joseph and I logged every single penny. Mr. Ramirez drops by to give free legal advice. How to protect a deed. How to form a micro LLC. How to look your kids in the eye and refuse to sign a power of attorney. The Widows Foundation already has 6 full-time residents. Women who showed up with 1 suitcase and a hollow stare. Exactly how I felt the week they deleted me from that chat. Now they have a roof, a garden they run themselves, and the ironclad guarantee that nobody can throw them out. John drives over on Wednesdays to fix their leaky pipes. He always comes back with a tired, genuine smile. He says he never thought he'd end up managing an estate, let alone managing the dignity of half the county. I keep logging the numbers. The notebook is officially half full. Every corporate deposit. Every maintenance fee Danny wires on the 1st of the month. Every meeting of the Notebook Women. It isn't revenge. It is a permanent record. It is what's left standing when the cheap talk burns away and only the concrete foundation remains. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the edge of the big bed. I pull the scratchy old blanket Joseph and I used to share over my lap, and I run my thumb over the brown leather. It still smells exactly like him, even though he's been in the ground for 11 years. And I realize every single second of it was worth it. The 12 years sweating under the sun. The jam jars packed with quarters. The late nights sewing cheap curtains until my fingers bled. because when the smoke finally cleared, the only person who truly understood how the game was played was me. If you know a woman who is slowly being erased from her own life, a woman getting deleted from the chat, shut out of the decisions, treated like a piece of obsolete machinery, send her this story. Make her listen to every single word. Let her know she is not crazy, she is not alone, and that old women always hold a hand the kids can't even comprehend. Don't do it for me. Do it because tomorrow, that woman could be her, or your mother, or your aunt. Let it go viral. Drop it right into the exact same family group chats where they try to silence us. Because when one woman locks her front gate and demands her respect, she hands the padlock key to 1,000 others. And at the end of the day, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days later, this is what remains. The white sign is still bolted to the iron gate. The paint is a little faded from the rain, but the words I painted that night are crystal clear. Every time a luxury SUV pulls up the driveway and John walks out to greet them with total authority, I remember the day they deleted me from a phone screen like I was a stranger. And I remember how I, 76 years old, hands covered in age spots, locked them out of the empire I built with my husband, handed them the bill, and taught them that a real family isn't a text thread about stock portfolios. A real family is built with patience, a leather ledger, and hands that never, ever stopped working. The gate stays locked to anyone who brings disrespect, and it opens just a crack for the ones who finally learned how to read what old women write down when nobody is looking.